Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector, author of the book 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, and the voice of experience on SF BookTube. And today we're going to look at the work of Michael G Coney, a neglected figure who is well worth your attention. So Michael G Coney, Michael Greatrex Coney, born in 1932 and died in 2005. English writer, very interesting guy. Much forgotten these days. You can pick up his books without too much difficulty, and I would urge you to do so. Going by my count, I think he produced 17 key books. There are a couple of small chapbooks, things like that, and I've read a dozen of them. And I started reading him at the end of the 80s and into the 90s, and I've revisited some recently, which has been an absolute joy. Later in the video, there are two clips from other videos I've made which feature his work, and you'll see them, so that'll be like a little time capsule for you. And he, as I said, was British. He moved to Canada permanently in 1973, and he worked for the British Columbia Forest Service until he retired from that in 1989, and he died in 2005. He was a very well-travelled man, as we will cover as we go throughout the video. Here I'm presenting his first novel. He started writing short stories in the late 60s, and then his first novel was Mirror Image, here represented in the Door first edition, which I believe is the world first edition, and it's a nice Kelly Freas cover there. And a lot of you will be familiar with this because it is a Door that's out there. It's getting increasingly hard to find it in really good condition. I've had two copies of this. I gave one to my friend Nick about a year and a half ago, and I thought I've just got to get another one. I picked this up, I think, off Dorset Bob. And then the Gollancz hardcover World First, which has the wonderful minimalist yellow livery, which some of you love and some of you hate, but I absolutely love. But there you go. So this is his first novel. This is the first in a loose sequence, which I would call the Amorphs Hetherington sequence. And I name it after two major plot elements. The Amorphs are the aliens in the book, and Hetherington is a capitalist type figure who has lots of money, and he sets up colony worlds in the future, and the novels take place on the colony worlds that Hetherington sets up, so he's the shadowy figure in the background. Mirror Image was published in 1972, and the basic idea is that the Amorphs are aliens who live on this particular planet, who have an incredible defense mechanism, which is that they fundamentally impersonate and take on the form of creatures who would prey on them or destroy them. And they're first noticed when the settlers are having quite a rough time on this planet. There's just a handful of people there, and they're trying to terraform in it, and it's going quite sort of bumpily. And they encounter this being which is being stalked by like a giant lizard, like a dinosaur, and it changes shape and size and becomes just like this giant lizard and has carnal knowledge with it. And it's quite incredible because from the beginning the characters are aware that the Amorphs can do this, but the Amorphs, when they take on a human shape, they then seem to take on human emotions, and they forget that they're actually aliens. This idea in essence is quite similar in a way to the one in Solaris, where the ocean on Solaris, which is sentient, can look into the minds of Chris Calvin and the other people on the space station above Solaris and recreate people or things from their past. So there's a kind of resonance with that, and it is a really good place to start with Coney's work. What's the best way to read them? I mean, there's several sequences. This is a good starting point, I would say. The series continues the following year in 1973 with Cissy, here in the UK Elmfield Press hardcover World First, and you can still pick this up. Mine's got terrible spine fading on there, and Elmfield did quite a bit of pulpy SF, and most of it is fairly sort of throwaway, but Coney is probably about the best thing they did, I would say. They did a John Brunner, I seem to recall, as well. A couple of good things, but some very sort of one-off things which are not so important. But Cissy is more linked to Mirror Image by the fact it's on a Hetherington colony world. Not the same characters. It's not set where the Amorphs live. It's a different thing. But it is a biological mystery, and Coney's really good at biology, and his depiction of biospheres is really interesting. And when I first read him, I was reminded of what Bruce Sterling did a little bit later in involution ocean. So he builds sort of ecologies really, really well. And he is very much a writer who is focused on human feelings. He's a guy who foregrounds characters very much, but the SF ideas are always there, and they're very, very strong. And, you know, they're not to be sniffed at. He's quite abrasive at times. He's very emotive. There's a good mix, actually, between the warmth that Coney has of his humanism and the more sort of gritty elements in his writing. He gets a really good balance between the two. I often think he didn't spend enough time on his books. He probably should have taken it a bit easier. But he was a writer who was working in the background. It wasn't his job. He was a working guy all his life. And aside from that work in Canada from 73 onwards, he ran a pub in Devon on the south coast of Britain in the 1960s for 3 years. Then he ran a hotel in Antigua, which is called the Jabberwock Hotel, which has some significance to what comes later in his career in the book The Jaws That Bite, the Claws That Catch, which I'll talk about later on. He was somebody who had this sort of background in sort of hospitality, and that comes through very much in his work. I'll admit I haven't read Cissy for a long time, but I really, really enjoyed it. And in terms of being part of the Amorphs Hetherington series, what I would say is that you can read these books as singletons, particularly this one. And this one is tangentially connected to Mirror Image, as I say. A little while after that, we're not taking these in chronology, we're taking them in series order because there are several series, came a book called Brontemek. And here's the Gollancz World First of Brontemek, the hardcover. Let me just get that tilted there, and I'll show you the rather beautiful pan lozenge. And this came out in 76, and Brontemek won the BSFA award for best novel of 1976, as you see there, very lovely pan lozenge. And this is set back on the world of the Amorphs as depicted in Mirror Image, and it's a great story. Again, I'm not going to tell you too much about it. There's quite a bit of hardware in it, as the title implies, but there's also a lot about human emotions confused with these aliens impersonating humans. And it has to be said, the thing I really love about Coney more than anything is that he does put people and emotions right in the foreground, and there is something almost adolescent and superheated about his prose. His characters are always falling in love. They're very often first-person male narrators surrounded by beautiful women. And the emotive side is really foregrounded. So they're often love stories. So they're like science fiction romances with a small R rather than a large R. But usually the situations and relationships between the male characters and female characters are integral to the science fiction elements of the plot. So he's really good at building that in. They're not just there for the sake of it, and you don't get the same feeling that you get from, say, Anne McCaffrey or Marion Zimmer Bradley. You know, they are more masculine, but they have a sort of warmth and adolescent charm to them. So, I mean, I think if I'd read these as a teenager, I probably would have really loved them. And they do have a wistful element, which I would liken to the best of Gary Kilworth, but Gary is tougher. So, you know, I think Dorset Bob and I were talking about these, and we were both saying that they were very comfortable, cozy reads. But when you go back to them and look at them, they do have those elements, but they also have a lot of action and adventure and ideas. And as I say, they do have their gritty sides. So that's the main three books in the Amorph sequence. This is a book from 1975 called Charisma, as you see represented here in the world first hardcover Gollancz Yellow Jacket, and an incredibly beautiful pan lozenge, to my thinking one of the most beautiful ones of all, and very difficult to find in that condition these days. And you'll see that his byline at this stage in the UK is Michael Coney. Sometimes you'll find books with Michael G Coney, some of them have Michael Greatrex Coney, but those tend to be the later ones. So Charisma is a kind of parallel world story in which a guy gets involved in this research which is going on that reveals there are multiple parallel worlds, like bubbles on the quantum foam, things splitting off from each other, and the Schrodinger's cat is it dead, is it alive in the box, we'll open the box, collapse the wave function, find out, that kind of thing. And fundamentally the protagonist gets to enter alternate worlds, but he can only do so because his equivalent in those worlds has died. So it is one of those things, and the differences between the worlds are very slight, so he is concerned that he's about to die in the real world. And this is set in a small fishing village in Cornwall, and this is a recurrent theme in Coney's work. He does a lot of seaside, shoreline, stranded, settings where you are always reminded of the English shoreline and the seaside holidays and that kind of thing. So if you're not from the UK, you would find these areas, you know, presumably quite exotic, but they do have the feel of summer holidays always. And this obviously comes from his time running a pub in Devon, which is a very big tourist area in the UK, and also from running the Jabberwock Hotel in Antigua, which would have been a resort type thing as well, and running a hotel. So the whole holiday thing is very big in Coney, and it makes for really great backgrounds, and charisma really does remind you of Cornwall. So that's a great singleton. It is tangentially connected to the Amorth's Hetherington series, only very slightly through one character. I'm not going to go into detail because I want you to discover yourself, but this is another one which has a very sort of vivid love story in it, and you know, there's a lot of darling, oh darling this, oh darling that a lot, but I don't want you to be put off because it is beautifully done, and he has a real voice of his own in the way that Bob Shaw has a voice of his own. I would say Coney has a voice of his own. Shaw was probably a better writer at his best, but overall I've been thinking a lot recently about how Shaw was uneven, Coney was uneven, but he was more of a piece than Shaw. And the differences between Shaw's great books and his bad ones are quite vast. With Coney, the differences between the really good ones and the not so good ones are not so pronounced, with one exception. We'll come on to that later on. But Charisma, one of the best titles of any science fiction novel, I think. Really, really good. And this wouldn't be a bad entry point, particularly if you like near future English SF. It'd be a really good place to go in. In my last video, I reviewed this book, The Hero of Downways, which I would much prefer a door version of. I'm not going to talk about that too much here, except to refer you back to the previous video, which is the one that has the thumbnail of Doris Perserchia's Earthchild. And it's my least favourite Coney. It's very minor indeed. And I would say I'd laid off reading it for a long time, and I was very disappointed by it, even though my expectations were low. But you can read about that, or hear about that rather, in the previous video. A door book that is well worth picking up if you can find it is Monitor Found in Orbit, which is Coney's only short story collection. Came out in the same year as Hero of Downways, or did it? No, Downways was 73 and Monitor Found in Orbit was 74. 74 was a big year for Coney. He had produced Mirror Image and Syzygy and Hero of Downways across 72 and 73. Then in 74, Friends Come in Boxes appeared, which we'll cover next. Winter's Children we'll also cover later. And also this collection of short stories. I haven't read these for years and years and years, and I can't remember anything specific about them, but I did remember enjoying it at the time. And of course they came from his early work while he was establishing himself as an SF writer in the magazines, before getting on board with his first novel, Mirror Image. Now, he was never particularly associated with New Worlds. Would I say he's a new wave writer? No, I wouldn't. I would say he is a classic English literary SF writer in that respect. He is one of the 4 C's, the big C's of 70s British SF. Predominant amongst those, of course, is D.G. Compton, the moralist, with his wonderful ethical take on SF, and easily the best writer of the 4. Coney, I would say then, is my second favourite. Then Richard Cowper, pronounced Cooper, that's C-O-W-P-E-R. And I'm going to do an overview of Cowper's work here. He's probably technically a better writer than Coney, but I actually find him less characterful, even though, as I say, technically he's more gifted. And then there's the real outsider, Edmund Cooper, and I still don't really know what I make of Edmund Cooper. I've not really read enough. I've only read 2, and I am intending to read more, but at the moment he is down at the bottom of those 4. So the 4 C's, though, they're all worth looking out for, because they give you a great snapshot of the variety, originality, and particular Englishness of British SF in the 60s and 70s. We're now looking at the period of Coney's career when he was producing singletons, and these were sort of popping in and out during his composition of the Amorth's Hetherington sequence. So he was a busy guy, you know, he worked very hard on these things. He was sort of really at it, and he was working full time as well, as I say. And these are 2 of his key singletons from this period. In fact, these critically are probably the most highly rated from that period, and as you can see, they are Gollanc's Yellow Jackets, Friends Come in Boxes. That's a very rare book in Gollanc's Yellow Jacket, especially in the condition I have it there, and Winter's Children, which is a bit more common but again, quite hard to find. Friends Come in Boxes was also published by Door as a paperback original in the States, and it is a fix-up, a load of short stories which you put together, and it does read episodically, but it is about overpopulation and a radical solution where people's brains are basically boxed, as it were. And there's a similar thing in William Schwartzberg's Grey Matters, which is a fun book, but this is better, and this is probably one of his darkest works, and I'd say there's quite a lot of acclaim. So if you're interested in nightmarish sort of near-future overpopulation things, this is a really good one to look at. As for Winter's Children, I covered this in a video a little while back, about a year and a half ago, I think, and we're going to clip to that now. This is again an Ice Age novel. The Ice Age has been going for about 50 years maybe when this takes place, and there's a small group of people who are living in the bell tower of a church, and the snow and ice have risen up, you know, to the height of this church, and they live there, and they've all got very interesting names like Paladin and Jacko, and I'm trying to remember some of the others. So they've got really memorable names, so as characters they really stand out, and they make their way out onto the snow and ice, and they have a snow boat which glides along the top there. It's rather like in Moorcock's The Ice Schooner, because Conrad Arth Lane has this wonderful clipper ship that zooms across the frozen seas, so it's affinity to that. And there are creatures out on the ice called pads, and you know, they're basically like giant mutant polar bears, you know, and the people, the survivors, both feed on them and are preyed on by them, and there's other stuff going on as well, but it's very much a human story, and I absolutely loved it. I love Coney's writing, even though this is a minor one. Probably my favourite Coney singleton from the mid-70s though is this book, which you see here with two titles: The Girl with the Symphony in Her Fingers from Elmfield Press UK, hardcover first, and the Door edition, which is called The Jaws That Bite, The Claws That Catch, but it's the same book, and I think you'll agree those are wonderfully pulpy covers. This is actually my worst condition hardcover first. As you see, the laminate has come off the jacket there, and I paid £3 for this in Hay-on-Wye about 1 million years ago. It's still got the pencil mark, and it's in a bit of a state. And this is a Josh Kirby cover, which is really good, but that is something from the book, so we'll talk about that now. And I've just reread this, and it was great fun to go back to it actually. So you notice the difference in the two titles, and variant titles are coming up more and more on BookTube because people are becoming more aware of them. From the beginning of the channel, I've always mentioned them because I'm always fascinated by them, and people say, why does this happen? Well, it doesn't happen so much now. It used to happen because the general feeling among American mass market publishers like Door was that the American market needed books which sounded like science fiction, that your title could not be too literary and could not be too vague, like for example Charisma would be an example of that. But this is where the exception that sort of makes the rule comes through, because The Girl with the Symphony in Her Fingers is quite sort of an SF-y title, I think, and it does have relevance to the plot. But then The Jaws That Bite, The Claws That Catch, of course, is a direct reference to the poem Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll from the Alice books, and that's relevant as well, so we'll come on to the two of them, but I'll talk about it. So it's an interesting thing. This should have had a far more prosaic title, but maybe Coney had some say in it, but obviously they didn't want The Girl with the Symphony in Her Fingers, so they might have thought that sounded a little bit too wishy-washy. But if you look at other variant titles as they come up, you'll see the British ones tend to be more literary and the American ones tend to be more dumbed down, which is a real insult to the North American audience, really, in my feeling. I've never liked it, and it doesn't happen so much these days. Anyway, what is the book about? This is set in a future, it's really hard to describe. I think it's set in Florida, but it's set somewhere, it is the United States, and there's been some geophysical activity. There's been a tidal wave on a peninsula, and it's had a huge impact, and then the tidal wave has rolled back, and somehow the land has risen up, and people have fish as pets, and they've augmented them with these devices so the fish can sort of wriggle around on land. So there are barracuda and sharks and moray eels going around with these like aqualungs on. It's really, really bizarre. And some people compare it to Vermilion Sands by J.G. Ballard, and I can see that, and it was a fix-up originally. They were short stories. So when you read them, as a novel, you might have tinkered a bit with the text, obviously. They don't come across as episodic. It is one sort of clear, straight through reading experience, it has to be said. So it is quite exciting narrative. There's a lot in it. The basic idea is that this is about a kind of future where, aside from the exotic things I've talked about there, and of course it is a seaside locale as well, there's a lot of yachts, and the characters are often riding these gliders, which is a really dangerous sport, but this is a big part of it, and there's some set pieces based around them. And the real background is the fact that in this future, people who are criminals become like bonded slaves. If you don't want to go to a penitentiary, and that word is used, so it is obviously an American setting, you can become the bonded servant of somebody who's free. What happens then if you're one of these servants is that your sentence is reduced by something like 25% to a third. And if your master, even though they almost have the power of life or death over you, if your master or mistress dies while you're in this service, then you instantly become free. So a lot of people opt for this, and it's quite interesting. And a large part of the book is taken up with the ethics of this and the fact that people are protesting about it. And it is quite a dramatic part of the book. And in that way, it has some similarity to things by G Coney, like Farewell Earth's Bliss. But, you know, it's nowhere near as grim and dark as that book is. The protagonist is a man who gets involved with this glider type sort of stuff. And he also runs a farm where there's these strange reptilian creatures called slithes. So it relates to the cow poem, "'Twas Brillig and the slithy toves," and the slithes, he farms them and they're reptilian and they change colour, so they're rather like chameleons. And he's approached by this old film star who has had lots of cosmetic surgery, and she's older than she looks, and she wants a dress made out of these things that will reflect her emotions. And that's like a flip back really to the way the Amorphs are in the Amorph Hetherington series. So there's a kind of thematic link there. So with Coney, you do see these sort of things coming up again and again. Superheated relationships, seaside locations, biology related to emotion. So, you know, you have got somebody with a real sort of consistency across their works. If you like those themes, they really resonate on top of each other really well. Then we come to the book I would say is probably my favourite Coney, and despite the critical acclaim for Friends Come in Boxes and Winter's Children, I think I would cleave to this one above all others. So I spoke about this in a video from last year, so we'll just go back in time again and review that little clip. I'm going to begin with an author who always I turn to in summer, and who always makes me think of summer, with a possible exception of one book, Friends Come in Boxes, which Brian Aldiss described as his toughest read. But the book I'm going to turn to first of all is a wonderful, wonderful summer book, and that's Hello Summer, Goodbye by Michael Coney, Michael Greatrex Coney. This is the Pan Lawrence edition. There we go, isn't that beautiful? And this is a fairly recent PS hardcover, because when this came out, this was 10 or 15 years ago, PS discovered there was an unpublished sequel to this book called I Remember Palahaxi, and that was issued with this in a slipcase set, and I still got that. I'm actually going to sell this one on because I do have a Golanc's Yellow Jacket first edition. So Michael Coney, let's tell you a bit about him first of all. He was British. He travelled around a lot, and he was a busy man. He was basically a hotelier and publican. He lived in Antigua in Canada. He ran pubs and hotels in these places. He ran pubs in the West Country, in the west of England, which is where we are today. And this book by him, Hello Summer, Goodbye, was published by Door in the US as Rax, which isn't such a good title, and obviously it's a more hardcore, skiffy sounding title. But Hello Summer, Goodbye, to me, conjures up the particular poetry, and there are leaves on the table here, you can hear the leaves crinkle, of Coney's work. And basically reading Michael G. Coney is almost like going on a summer holiday, a beach holiday, a particularly British beach holiday. And this is fundamentally the story of an adolescent going on a protracted holiday in the summer to a fishing village. It sort of stands in for Cornwall really. It's on an alien planet, and the narrator and his people, they're humanoids, but there's no sort of suggestion they're from Earth. And he, every summer, will go back and stay in this place by the coast. And he's a young man, he's an adolescent, as I say, and he's got a bit of a yearning for a young woman he met called Tallahassee Brown Eyes. And people's names in this culture are based on where they come from. So Tallahassee is the place. And the reason the novel is called Rax in America is because the planet is part of a double system with a large planet called Rax, which is nearby. So it has an elliptical orbit around its star. And what this means is that it has very, very intense, hot, long summers, and then very, very, very harsh winters. So it's a book about the changing of the seasons and the joy of summer. It's a book that's full of sentiment, nostalgia, longing, and the culture that's depicted is fairly sort of low tech. And this young man, he's a little bit of an outsider. He's not getting on very well with his parents. He's trying to fit in with other kids. And there is a civil war going on in the background. There's a certain amount of political situations, but he goes back to this place in the summer and he wants to sort of meet up with this beautiful young woman. And it's a very charming book. It's very wistful. It's sweet, yet it's astringent at its edges. And as I say, there's one sequel. I can only say that the plot is secondary, I feel, to the feel. But, you know, it has the interesting astronomical stuff. It's got some really sort of interesting alien life forms which are well depicted. There are sailing scenes in which those come into play, and you've got the ship there on the cover, which gives you an idea. So this is really a bit like, if you're not from the UK, you've never experienced it, reading this book is a little like going on holiday to Devon and Cornwall. And if you're from a non-British culture, the exoticism comes through that you would experience if you went to those places, comes through in the way this book is written. So it's really beautiful. And I always turn to Coney when I want something romantic, and I mean romantic with a small r. He does have some burrs and chamfers and sharp edges, and you know, he's probably a bit tougher than people say he is, but wonderful, wonderful stuff, and very gentle and elegiac, and it makes you look back at your youth, and also it's something which advises you to enjoy your youth. It's really important stuff. So that's Hello Summer, Goodbye. So as I say, in the USA, the book was called Rax, which is very different to Hello Summer, Goodbye. And that's an example of the VT thing, the variant title thing, where you see a slightly dumbed down title being used and a more SF-ish title, because Hello Summer, Goodbye may seem a bit too gentle and pastoral for a North American eye. Though for an English science fiction thing, it was absolutely ideal and resonated with loads of us. And next to it you can see the sequel, I Remember Tallahassee, which was published by PS Publishing decades afterwards. He could never sell it at the time. It's not as good as Hello Summer, Goodbye. It is worth reading. Same setting, same characters, more or less. It does develop the story a bit. Not one of my favourite Coneys. Never ever been paperbacked, I don't think. Maybe Cosmos Wildside do one. And it has an introduction by Eric Brown, who is a massive fan of Coney. And Dorset Bob was telling me once that he tracked down some very obscure Coney chapbooks for Eric, who is a huge fan. And if you've read Eric Brown, or if you haven't, he does have a lot of affinity with Coney. And, you know, Brown's another one of those writers who's very cozy and comfortable and fun. He's real mind candy. But I love his stuff, and I think maybe sometime soon I'll do a Brown feature. I've got lots I've read, lots I haven't read. I'm not a completist. I am more of a completist with Coney, but Brown is similar. So if you've read Eric Brown, if you imagine a more, how can I put it, a more abrasive Eric Brown, so in that way, Coney comes in between Gary Kilworth, who's tougher and thornier, but still very compassionate, and Brown is a little bit on the softer end. So Coney falls sort of in between the two, really. And a final comment on the VT situation. When it was reissued in Canada in the early 90s, Hello Summer, Goodbye, aka Rax, was called Tallahassee Tide in Canada. So there you go, a book with 3 different titles. Absolutely bizarre. After Brontemek won the BSFA award in '76, Coney had been working very, very hard for the previous 4 or 5 years before that on this tranche of novels we've covered. Decided to dig into his bottom drawer and sell some manuscripts that he'd prepared much earlier, which he hadn't sold. And of course, Ian Banks did this after The Wasp Factory, Walking on Glass and The Bridge were things he'd written much earlier that he hadn't sold. And of course, this is something which used to happen quite a lot. And, you know, you can't blame writers for having sort of spent time building up manuscripts. They can't sell them. They want to sell them and bring some money in. So between Bronte in 76 and the start of his final sequence of books, which start to appear in sort of 82, 83, these two books popped up. And these are amongst the hardest Coneys to get. First of all came The Ultimate Jungle, which, let's see, when did that come out? 1979. This is the Millington hardcover first, and it's the only edition there's ever been of The Ultimate Jungle, as far as I'm aware. I don't think there was ever a mass market paperback. Millington were a small UK publisher who were around in the mid-70s. They didn't last that long. I'm very fond of their books. They have a great look to them. As you see, this is incredibly simple. But I think The Ultimate Jungle is one of the very best science fiction titles of the 70s. I love it because it just screams. What it screams at me, when I looked at that, I thought, God, is this going to be like Hot House? What's it going to be like? What does it actually mean, The Ultimate Jungle? And this was a book that my friend Graham, the grumpy old man, who sometimes appears on the channel with me, we hopefully will get that back together soon, and I looked for a long time. We both really enjoyed. And this is really, really superheated. It's very adolescent. It's boiling sort of love and sex all the way through. It's a very difficult book to describe, but fundamentally the plot comes down to this. There's a computer prediction that says that the world is going to end some years in the future, and mankind begins to build ways out, and one of them is to have a generation starship, and the other is to have a kind of virtual reality situation. And I don't recall so much about that, but what I remember about the book, reading it, was that this seemed to be a very strange combination of the kind of jungle situation that you get in Brian Aldiss's Hot House, very inventive, but also a multi-tier, multi-level generation starship idea, like in Aldiss's Non-Stop. And it's very feverish and frenetic. And I must reread it because I really enjoyed it. But I remember at the time thinking that it was very full on, possibly not as well crafted as some of his other books. When I recently read Hero of Downways, it had a similar feel, but this was much, much better, so I do want to return to it. If you ever see it, pick it up anyway, because as I say, it's really, really scarce, and if you like British SF, and particularly things which are really florid, I would really go for it. So if you see it, just pick it up. Then in 1981, Neptune's Cauldron appeared, and this is a Tower science fiction paperback. Again, this is the only edition there ever was, and I can honestly say this was such a hard book to find pre-internet. Me and Graham, we both looked for it for years and years and years, and it was the big sore thumb in our Coney collections. Neither of us could find it, really hard to find. And eventually we found it, and then of course once the internet got going and ABE got going, there are copies everywhere. That's the only edition there's ever been, as I think I've said, and it is an undersea adventure on the aquatic planet Storm. Aliens and humanoids struggle to escape the dark power of Neptune's Cauldron. And for me it was very like Medusa's Children by Bob Shaw. Now Medusa's Children is regarded as a minor Shaw, but I actually really like it. I've read it at least twice, and it, funnily enough, has the kind of superheated sensuality that you get in Coney. So I wouldn't be surprised if Neptune's Cauldron was influenced by that, but I'm not sure when it was written. Nobody seems to know when these two books were written. We just know they were written earlier on and they couldn't be sold. They have the feel of his mid-70s work. He was obviously really cooking then, so he got those sold, got those out there, and took a break while he developed his next stage of writing. And I suspect he was busy in his job and had got quite exhausted by pushing out quite a lot of books in a short period of time while working full-time. Coney completed his career with a sequence which is arguably 5 books, but you could look at it as 2 different diptychs of 2 books each and a slightly related singleton, so it is quite confusing. But basically this is the first diptych of the 2, and The Song of Earth was the title, and it's volume 1 and volume 2 in their American hardcover first. The Celestial Steam Locomotive and Gods of the Great Way. And Coney was a big fan of steam trains, I read, an autobiographical essay very much, which he went on and on and on about them. He was a big fan of them. And he was rather miffed that this US cover had, you know, a classic frontier cowcatcher train on the cover. He wanted something British on it, but you know, it is what it is. But I think it's quite pretty. I've never read these. These are the Coneys, the last 5 of the ones I've never read. I used to sell them back in the day, back in the 80s, but I never fancied them at the time. And they actually put me off reading his work because they look more like fantasy novels, but they are SF novels, as I'll reveal. The basic idea of the Song of the Earth is that it's a multiverse, alternate universe sort of thing, where there are multiple alternate worlds created by this computer, by an AI or a sequence of AIs called the Rainbow. And related to that, there's also a godlike alien, which is called something like Squarkwin, I seem to remember. And this alien and the AIs are creating these rather dreamy virtual reality backgrounds for people to live in. And I say, it sounds very high concept. I've never ever read them, so I must. So these are the first two which were related. Also, just before these, there was a book which does kind of tie in, which popped up the year before in 1982. That book is Cat Carina, again here in a Gollancz yellow jacket. So that was his first sort of major book since Brontemex, sort of 6 years earlier. So apart from those bottom drawer things, he laid off. And I've never read this. I sell it at the time and never fancied the look of it. Some people have said to me that it's a little like Cordwainer Smith, because in this rainbow universe of alternate realities, there are other sort of races which are quasi-human, and obviously this is a cat sort of character in this one, which instantly makes you think of Cordwainer Smith, things like Game of Rat and Dragon. So I am planning to read this quite soon, because I think it would be a good way into the sequence for me. And as I say, I've read, what have I got? I've got 17 Coneys and I've read 12. And doing some rereading recently, even though I didn't like Hero of Downways, it was great to go back to Go with the Symphony of Fingers and some bits and pieces of other ones. And I am keen to read one I haven't read, which is really nice to have one. So this is a kind of precursor to the Celestial Steam Locomotive and Gods of the Great Way. Coney retired from the British Columbia Forest Service in 1989, and he retired from writing at that time as well. It could be that he possibly just had had enough, I don't really know. It could have been that he was struggling to sell work, though he managed to sell these. And these are, as you see, the Arthurian fantasies, Fang the Gnome and King of the Sceptred Isle. And these are another diptych, but they are part of the Song of Earth series. They depict one of the alternate worlds, which is an Arthurian world. So they are tangentially related to them. And I remember them coming out and thinking, oh God, you know, he's decided to write even more fantasy-based novels. And I was much, much keener on my SF at that point. But in recent years, my interest in Arthurian things has grown. So these will be sort of foregrounded more. And when I read these things, I will review them in more depth and talk about them in more depth, because I think by then, by the time I get around to them, more of you will have read Coney's early work, which I hope you enjoy. So that was the end of his career. He never did anything after that, apart from very minor things. I think there was a chapbook, which was a cat story, some other bits and pieces, but he sort of faded from the scene, really. Great shame, neglected writer. I would say get to look at his work. Highlights, probably Hello Summer Goodbye, definitely. Mirror Image is probably the best, really early one. And also I would say The Girl with the Symphony in Her Fingers, aka The Jaws That Bite, The Claws That Catch. So there you go. Michael Coney, one of the 4 C's forgotten British SF writer. Hope you've enjoyed that. Let me know if you've read any Coney. Let me know if you're going to when you do read some. Let me know what you've enjoyed. I guess we can continue the discussion about his work when I've read some more of them. Thanks a lot. Bye for now.